Hi everyone, my name is Nancy Leon. I'm the training manager here at Emily's List, and I'm really excited to be here with you all today for our running in a primary training. We really appreciate you all taking the time to learn with us today. First, I just want to give you a little bit of background on what Emily's List is. We are the largest resource for women in politics. We help recruit and train pro-choice Democratic women to run for office. Since our founding in 1985, we've helped elect over 150 women to the House, 26 to the Senate, 16 governors, and more than 1,300 women to state and local office. We've also had over 60,000 women reach out to us and say that they're ready to run for office. So these trainings will help give you the tools to set the foundation for your campaign journey. Just to quickly run through our agenda, we're going to do some quick welcoming and housekeeping announcements, and some we already did. Then we're going to talk about some primary basics, data and targeting, messaging that you want to consider for your primary. We'll do a quick Q&A on that section. Then we'll talk about fundraising and a case study and another Q&A section. And so webinar norms, firstly, invest in our time together, ask questions. Thank you to all the folks who already sent those questions in beforehand. The more that you participate in the trainings, the more that you'll get out of them. And again, all questions are valid. So if you have any questions during the training, you can just put them in the webinar toolbar, and we'll have someone on there trying to answer all your questions. And lastly, all slides are internal, so we won't be sending you this PowerPoint, but we will be sending you a recording of the training after it's over. All right, and now to get started, I'm going to hand it off by introducing our first trainer for today, who is Emily Parras, State and Local Regional Director for the West. And she's going to go through the first half of the training, and then I'll come back for a Q&A. So I'll just hand it over to Emily now.
Thanks, Nancy. Like Nancy was just kind of kicking us off, we've got a couple goals for our time together. First, really thinking about how to set yourself apart from those running against you when it comes to messaging in a crowded primary. When we talk about messaging strategy, and we'll also be giving some tips for how to reach your primary fundraising goals. But let's start with the basics. So when we're talking about primaries, we are really fundamentally talking about how do we get access to the general election ballot, right? If you want to be on the ballot in November in a partisan race, you often need to win the partisan primary a couple of months before, and so that's what we're talking about. Primaries can be what we call like an open seat, which is when you're not running against an incumbent, or a challenge. So when the incumbent candidate from the same party is being challenged by someone else. We are not talking, when I say open seat, just a clarifying, we are not talking about states like California or a couple other places where you've got open jungle primaries where they're nonpartisan. For our context today, when I'm saying open seat, I'm talking about no incumbent running. But with all the details and the nomenclature, fundamentally we're talking about getting access to the general election ballot, and the best way to win a primary is by distinguishing yourself as a candidate, having a clear and compelling message for your district, communicating it with your voters, and proving that you're competitive. So as you're thinking about a race, there's a couple first questions that you're going to want to be asking yourself. And we'll dig into some of these. There's also an upcoming training called Researching Your Race that's coming up on February 22nd. Excuse me. It's called What Office Should I Run For? Lots more if you want to dig in there. But when we're talking about researching your race, we want to understand, fundamentally, is this a blue seat, right? If I win this primary, am I really not going to have a very competitive general election? Is it a Republican seat, right? Do I think it's going to be an uphill battle even if I win the primary to win the general election? Or do I think that this is a place where it's going to be really competitive in the general? It's flippy, it's purpley. Some of the other fundamentals you'll want to know about the race: how many people generally vote? How do they vote? When do they vote? In primaries, can independents in your state vote? And then on the financial piece, which we'll dig into much more deeply later in the training, right? What do previous candidates raise to be competitive in a race like this? If they're challenging an incumbent, how much did that incumbent raise the last time? What's their fundraising potential, right? With the idea that you want to, one, be able to raise enough money to communicate with voters, and two, like raise enough to signal that you're a serious candidate for this race. In addition to some of the like fundamentals of the race, there's some questions that you're going to want to ask just to see if this is a fit with you personally, professionally, publicly, politically. And so when I think about that match question, is this the right race for me right now? I think about like what types of seats are available and when, right? Is this going to be an open seat? Do I know that my incumbent is termed out? Because we know the power of incumbency is really powerful, and you want to, and so maybe you're thinking about, okay, when is this person termed out, or is there a special election when there's a moment where I might be able to kind of be more competitive than normal. We think about also just the fundamentals of the race, right? Am I running for a part-time city council seat that doesn't pay? Does that work with what the needs of my family and my professional needs? Some state legislatures are, part-time, half the year you got to drive across the state to be in the state capitol. Is that something that you could do, right? So these are some of the questions when we say, like, is this the right race for me? Is this a good match that you'll be wanting to dig into? There's lots of other questions here too, right? Like, how do you get on the ballot? What are some of the other election laws? Keep digging into these. If you're a research nerd like me, you'll go down a Google hole and like wake up a couple hours later having learned a lot more, but with even more questions about, is this the right race for me? I feel like I probably gave away that I'm already a nerd, but now we've gotten to targeting and data basics, and the like inner former math teacher in me is very excited about these next couple of slides. So when we're talking about targeting and data basics in a primary, like the first thing that I always think about is a win number. And a win number is exactly what it sounds like. How many votes do I need on the primary election day in order to win? And there's lots of resources out there that can help you kind of figure that out. Your Secretary of State and Board of Election will have a lot of historic data there. The VAN will have additional data about voters who have voted in primaries. But fundamentally, when we're thinking about a win number, we're both looking backwards and looking forwards. We are saying, okay, when I look backwards in elections like this primary that I want to run in, how many people in my district turned out to vote? What percentage did former candidates need in order to win? Did you need 50%? Do you just need a majority? And then when we look forward, we're thinking, okay, when I think about this next election, do I think the turnout's going to change at all? How many new registrants do I think are going to be there? With redistricting coming up, we imagine that there will be a lot of changes in maps as well, right? So we're looking backwards and forwards to make an estimate on how many voters we think we need in order to win on election day. Cool. And then, so once we have an idea of how many voters we need in order to win on election day, our win number, we're going to think about targeting. We're going to think about who are my likely voters, who are the folks I think are most likely to turn out and cast a vote in this primary. And primaries are a little bit, they're harder sometimes to do some of this targeting on, because not everybody votes in primary elections. Again, states have different rules. I live in Colorado, which just started to allow independent and declined to state voters to vote in partisan primaries, but their rules are a little bit different. But this is a place where you'll want to be taking a look at your voter database, the VAN, to be thinking about who are the likely voters to vote in a primary election. Sometimes we also look at, new voters. Did they just register and move into the district, but then they voted in the most recent election? So I have a hunch that they might turn out in the primary. Sometimes we also look at special elections or municipal elections, other places where people who don't vote just in general elections will turn out. So we've thought about a win number. We thought about who our likely voters are likely to turn out. And then we think about, are there any, do I have a base in this district? Again, this is harder and it looks different in primary elections than it does in general elections. In general elections, if you're running as a Democrat, you know that your base is probably like solidly Democratic voters, and that you just need to make sure that they turn out. In primaries, that's often a lot harder. But I do think about two things when I'm thinking about targeting in a primary. I think about where my natural supporters might be, either demographically or geographically. So demographically, for instance, if you are the only woman running in a race with like 10 other men, then you might want to be talking or over investing in the women in your district, right? And think that they might be more natural supporters. Geographically rather, I was working with a candidate who was the president of their parent-teacher association at their children's school. And so we over-targeted in the precincts around that school because those are the people, one, who are more likely to know her, and two, were more likely to, like when she knocked on the door and said she was the PTA president at the school down the street, that meant something to them. So those are the things I think about, but it's not always super clear who your base is in a primary, and often the answer is you're just going to have a compelling message and talk to a lot of likely primary voters and raise the resources to do that. Messaging. Speaking of talking to voters, what are you going to say when you talk to them? Again, at its core, when we're talking about coming up with a message for your campaign, we are talking about concisely, powerfully describing who you are, what your values are, and doing so in a competitive primary in a way that sets you apart from other candidates in your race. I think the other piece that is really particular to primaries more than generals is that primary voters and activists and donors as well often want to hear why you think you can win to a greater extent. And so you'll want to be thinking broadly, like what makes you best positioned to win the general or the primary and the general in this race. Clearly at Emily's List, we deeply believe that early fundraising success is a critical piece to that. But it also can be measured by putting together a strong and professional team, by really impressive field metrics. I had a candidate that I was working with who had answered this question by saying, I've raised X much money and I've called every single primary voter in my district. Right, so being able to tell that story is really important to include in your message as a primary candidate. And then in terms of like tactics, like how do I actually build that compelling message? One of my favorite tools to use is what we see here, which is a message box. And I'll do just like a quick overview of this. But again, if you have more questions or want a template for a message box, you can find that in our training center at Emily's List. So a message box is a tool for us to kind of lay out all of the different potential things that we could say about ourselves during a campaign, what our opponents are going to be saying about themselves, what we might say about our opponents, and what our opponents might say about us. And so the process is really laying all of this information out to then condensed down to a concise, proactively positive message that contrasts you with your opponents. And so an example where I've used this, I think is kind of illustrative. I was working with a candidate who was relatively new to the district and was running against someone who had lived there for a long time. They were very afraid that the incumbent was going to, kind of use that as an attack against them, that they weren't as connected to the district. So what we did after we thought about all the things that we could say about her was we realized, oh, she comes from a military family. The reason she has not lived in one place for her entire life is because of this other value and important part of her biography, right? And so we included that as part of her message proactively. As a military or as a child of veterans, like she grew up with these values. What that meant was that it was harder for people to then attack her for not living there for her entire life. So again, I'd encourage folks to take a look at this messaging tool, the message box, to really think about how do you positively contrast yourself with your opponents, and how do you positively kind of protect yourself from any potential attacks throughout the campaign. That said, standing out in a primary, especially a competitive open primary with lots of candidates, can be really hard. Just organizationally and institutionally, in a contested Democratic primary, often the party will not get involved officially before the primary, unless they're supporting an incumbent. Organizations may choose not to endorse until after a primary. And then, it's also possible that, if you're running multiple Democrats in a crowded field against each other, the policy differences aren't that different. But there's still ways for you to craft your message and drive your campaign in ways that will help you stand out. One is to make sure that you're talking about your bio and your personal values. You don't need to be matching your opponent's press releases or website policy issue for policy issue. What will often separate you from your opponents is who you are and why you're running. I was working with a candidate who there was another gentleman in the primary, and when he launched his website, he had his full resume on there, and there were all the Ivy League schools that he went to, and his 17-point plan for recycling, and that was who he was and why he was running. And when I talked with our candidate, the answer to maybe the nerves that came when they put out their information was not to try and come up with an 18-point recycling plan. It wasn't to go resume line for resume line. It was to go back to why she was running. What was her story, her personal experience, her values, and keep telling that story. And now a case study. I feel like I've thrown in lots of mini case studies throughout this. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some primary candidates that we worked with in New Mexico in the state Senate this past cycle, particularly because when we talk about primaries, especially when we talk about challenging incumbents, there are a couple, few stories throughout the country of people that get get a lot of attention for unseating an incumbent in a primary. And part of that is because one, it's pretty rare and it's hard to do. We worked with a handful of candidates in the state Senate who were challenging conservative Democratic state senators. And there was a variety of outcomes there. A handful of them were able to unseat an incumbent in a primary and then go on to win in the general. Some won their primary but then lost in the general, and a couple were unable to win in a primary. The context of this, though, is that there was a group. So it was a coalition, not just one individual. And there were Democratic state senators who had a history of taking votes that were anti-abortion, anti-labor, anti the environment, by and large. And so what we saw here was an opportunity to or you had incumbents who were out of step with their districts. So in solidly Democratic districts, they were voting for anti-choice legislation. And so I think there's something to take away there about, one, being able to point to issues where the incumbent was out of step with their district. Two, the broad coalition, right? So these folks weren't just doing this on their own. They weren't just saying, hey, I've got a problem with my incumbent, and so I'm going to take them out all by myself. No, they were in coalition with lots of folks that wanted to see new voices. And three, like, it was really hard, right? And some of them were successful and some of them weren't. But at the end of the day, you want to get to the core of like what we started this conversation with, which is, why am I running? Like, who am I? What are my values? What am I trying to accomplish through this? And that, at its heart is what primaries and elections are all about. So I think that's all my slides, and we're going to go to some Q&A. Is that right, Nancy?
Yes, I am back. Thanks so much for going through that first section with us. We have 3 questions. And the first one is, when should I start preparing for a primary for a 2022 election?
Yeah. Now. Like, it is never too early. It is not too early to start for 2022. It is not too early to start for 2024. It is not too early to start if you don't know what you want to run for or when. And we'll get into fundraising and some of like the early steps you can take right after this. But I think that's where I would start, is thinking about getting my list of potential donors in line. I'd be thinking about the relationships that I'm building in my district, both at the grass tops, so influencers, and at the grassroots. Yeah, it's never too early to start.
Awesome. Yeah, as early as possible. Awesome. All right. Our next question is, what is the process like for getting local party endorsements, or does that not happen during a primary? Could you talk about how to get in with a strong party machine?
Yeah. This one kind of varies by district, or by region rather. It is not uncommon for parties to stay out of primaries. The exception being, if they've got an incumbent running, they'll often have their party support behind incumbents. Mm. But sometimes there's like partisan or party adjacent organizations that might do an endorsement. So for instance, your state party may not endorse and probably won't, but maybe your local chapter of Stonewall Democrats, which is LGBT members of the Democratic Party, maybe they endorse. So that's something you'll want to investigate and have lots of one-on-one meetings as you're going around and building relationships and see what they do. It's never a bad idea to ask. Like, yeah, ask if they'll endorse. Ask if they won't endorse. Ask what else they could do to help. And then the question about how do you get engaged with a strong party machine, that one also has some regional differences. But broadly, I would say, like, if you've decided that you really want to build relationships and go through the party structure, then like go in, right? And volunteer, work with the party structure, show up for meetings, keep building relationships, and figure out like who is actually making the decisions within the party. But that's often hard to know from the outside.
Yeah, got it. Thank you. And the last question is, my district is likely to change substantially. If it didn't, I might not even get I might not even have a primary challenger. But if it does, as is expected, the primaries will likely be crowded with way more experienced career politicians. What tips do you have for managing redistricting in a primary process?
Oh, redistricting. I think redistricting is going to be add additional challenges and opportunities, right, for everybody as state legislative districts and congressional districts are going to be redrawn based on the 2020 census. Not to make it more complicated, but because the census was so delayed, we're also going to see in a lot of states the redistricting and the new maps that's taking longer than it has in previous years. Which is to say that, like, you know, if you don't know exactly what your district is going to look like, that's okay. Nobody else does either. We're all on the same page. So what you can be doing is still the same, which is getting ready to fundraise aggressively, building relationships within your district with individuals and organizations. So building those that political capital, and trying out and testing your message, right, and getting and honing it in. And it may not be super satisfying, but like, know that everybody's in the same boat with redistricting, and what you can control is what you can always control: how much money you raise, how you talk about yourself, and the relationships that you build.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Emily. That is our last question for this section. Thanks so much. I'm gonna let you go now. And I'm gonna now welcome on our second trainer who's gonna walk through fundraising for us. Her name is Sarah Carrillo. She is the Midwest State and Local Finance Advisor, and she's gonna go through the next half of our training.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Nancy. Thanks for that introduction. We are going to kick things off talking about fundraising. So Emily referenced fundraising quite a bit. Fundraising is super important in any campaign, but especially in a primary campaign. In order to start off strong and make sure that your campaign flows the way you want it to, so you can ultimately emerge victorious from that primary, you'll need to think about a couple of things. First, I want to emphasize that fundraising demonstrates strength. It also shows your priorities. When you fundraise, it shows everyone who's watching that you'll be able to pay for what you need to get your message out there and make sure voters know your name. When you raise money, you can then use it to pay for literature, commercials, your website, whatever you need. It also shows who you are as a candidate. When you look back at your campaign after the primary or after the general election, you want your fundraising to really reflect who you are as a candidate. So when you think back, if you can think about how much you've raised in the past through your cycle, through the election, that number that you've raised can show that you're willing to work hard and also that you're willing to ask everyone for money. You include everyone in that process. You'll also want to be able to think about how many donors have given to your campaign. When you have a large number of donors, that means that a lot of people care about electing you. They care about investing in your campaign. You don't need to have 900 donors that give $1,000 each. Having 900 donors who give $5, $1, definitely counts. But all of those different people who have donated show that lots of people care about your campaign. You can also look at the average contribution. When your campaign ends, do you want to say that your average contribution was $10,000? That seems pretty inaccessible to me. I don't know about you, but I couldn't write a $10,000 check to a campaign. However, if I see that a campaign has a lower average contribution, $5, $25, $110, whatever it might be, that shows that this is an accessible campaign. People of all different backgrounds are able to get involved regardless of their income level. And then finally, you can take a look at where donors live. When your campaign ends, do you want to have donors that live only in your neighborhood, in your district? Is it important to you to have donors from across the country who all care about specific issues that you care about? I can't answer those questions, but I'd encourage you to think about what that narrative is that you want your fundraising to tell. That's really important. If you've watched an Emily's List webinar before, you might have heard of the circles of benefit. Has anyone seen those before? You can drop a yes or no in the chat. Okay, I'm seeing some yeses, cool. Seeing some nos, love it. So we're going to focus on two different circles. You'll see right in the middle that you've got the candidate. That's you. You're the person in the middle of this whole campaign. Our arrows going outward, time and viability, increase as they reach the outer circles. The further from the candidate a circle is, the more time it will take to convince them to donate to your campaign, and the more viability you'll need to prove in order to get them to donate. So when I say viability, I really mean like things that demonstrate that you could be the person who wins. So we'll talk a little bit about the personal circle first. So your personal circle is the first group of donors that will engage with your campaign, ideally. Like I said, you're in the middle, you're the candidate, you're the center of everything, but your personal circle is really close to you. Your personal circle will be the first group to come join your campaign and be a part of what you're building. This could usually include family members, friends, people you work with, neighbors, people you went to school with, your children's friends' parents, or your children's friends' parents. Yes, had a hard time saying that. People that you know, people who care about you, people who are in your life. These people will invest in the campaign early, not because of necessarily what you stand for, although they might, or because of anything necessarily political. They'll support you because they care about you. They care about your endeavor and because you're doing something big and exciting and they want you to be successful. So just to make sure everyone's on board with who's in their personal circle, can you go ahead and drop a person who would be in your personal circle in the chat? Thinking like someone on the school board with you, or perhaps your next door neighbor. Okay, I'm seeing college roommate. Yep, love it. Next door neighbor, awesome. Librarian, absolutely. If you know you're a librarian, go for it. Cool. So we'll talk more about the personal circle again, but moving on, we'll talk about the ideological circle next. So your ideological circle is the next circle in our donor circle. Your ideological donors will typically give after the personal donors do, and they'll give to you because they care about what you care about. Your ideological donors are passionate, they're cause-oriented, and they're motivated by a mission. These are people who will probably give early to your campaign. They won't worry about waiting, and they'll be willing to take a risk. The reason they'll give is because they want the same change that you want. So your ideological donors could care about any of the things that you care about. It could be something big like clean energy, choice. Choice is important to Emily's List. It could be something more local. It could be like fixing a specific bridge in your town. It could be changing a specific curriculum in your public schools. It could be state related. It could be campaign finance reform in your state. Whatever it might be, your ideological donors will also care about it, and they'll want you to win because you care about it. So if you can go ahead and drop something in the chat, tell me about a type or group of ideological donors that would care about your campaign, no matter what you're running for. Parks, yep, totally. People care about parks. That sounds great to me. What else? Libraries again. Yeah, I'm all about the libraries. People who care about funding for libraries. All sorts of COVID things. Yeah, people who care about COVID aid and assistance and funding, vaccine distribution. These could all be ideological circle issues for sure. Awesome. So it seems like everyone's got the hang of personal and ideological circles. Love it. Like I mentioned a minute ago, the arrows going out demonstrate how much time and viability you'll need to reach each of those circles, but luckily your ideological and personal circles are right there next to the candidate, so it'll take less time to get these people to donate. So keeping that in mind, let's talk about some things you should do before you announce to make sure that your fundraising is in a good spot as soon as you launch your campaign. Before you do anything, you should Rolodex, 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 Rolodex again. Rolodexing is when you review all of your contacts, every person you know, every person you've ever met, and think about who you can ask to be a part of your campaign. maybe people who can volunteer, but also people who can donate. So people who can make a donation of any size and be a part of what you're building. So when you do that, when you start to map out who is in your Rolodex, you should start by focusing on your personal circle. So I'd really encourage you to think about who in your personal circle you know that your primary opponent or opponents don't. So do you live in a different area of the city than they do? Did you participate in certain clubs in college they have no connection to? Have you followed a different career path? What are the things that distinguish you, and who do you know that they don't? These are people in your personal circle that you can pull in right away. You can also think about who do you have access to that no one else does. So thinking about that ideological circle, which issues do you care about that or have a different position on than your opponent? So since this is Emily's list, we'll talk about choice. If you have an anti-choice opponent, we'll use another example later. Who might donate to your campaign that won't donate to your opponent? Probably other people who care about choice. If you are passionate about the school board, or school funding, but your opponent has never talked about it before, sounds like you should really appeal to people who care about school funding. So you can see that as you map out your Rolodex, these personal and ideological circles are really important to help identify who you can go to first to build that strong fundraising operation. If you do want to know more about Rolodexing, quick plug, we do have lots of resources for that. We have a webinar that you can view just by checking out our website under our trainings, and that can walk you through a little bit more of mapping out your contacts. Moving on from Rolodexing, once you've Rolodexed, you should go ahead and start making some plans and establishing goals and benchmarks. So like our friend Senator Warren, you should have plans, lots of plans. The first thing you should do is check out your state's Secretary of State or Bureau of Elections, whatever it might be in your state, and figure out what you're allowed to do. What are your contribution limits? How much are people allowed to give you? Can they give you cash? Does it need to be a check? Can you set up an ActBlue page or some other online giving platform? Think about those types of things. I'd also encourage you to think about when you want to raise certain amounts of money. The day you launch your campaign, do you want to have $1,000 in the bank, $10,000, $500? Figure out what you'll need to have at different points in time. How much will you need after 2 months of your campaign? Things like that. And then finally, once you establish your goals and your plans and your benchmarks, start thinking about how you'll ask those people in your Rolodex for contributions so you can hit your goals. It all comes together, right? So why are you the right candidate? Why should these people give to you? Think about what your message will be and be ready to make that ask. So as soon as you're able to fundraise, as soon as you filed your paperwork or whatever you need to do, make sure that you've literally written out in your Rolodex what you will say to each of those people to make an ask of them. So if you're talking to your friends and family in your personal circle, your next door neighbor, your high school volleyball coach, a roommate from college, a colleague from 10 years ago, whatever or whoever it might be, what will you ask them? Will you say, "Hi, this is Sarah. Want to catch up with you. Let's chat. Also, I'm doing this really cool thing. I really, really hope that you will be a part of it." Also think about your ideological donors. Will you kick things off by telling them that you really care about the park in the center of town and that you're committed to preserving it? Seems like no one else has, and it's time that someone does. Will they make a contribution of $20? Think about what your ask will be and get that ready so that you have it on hand. You don't have to think about it when it's time to launch. You can just go. All right, that was a lot of me talking. And I'm about to talk a little bit more. So Emily told us a little bit about the different types of primaries. We have fundraising in an open primary and fundraising in a challenge primary. We'll start by talking about an open primary. The main thing to think about in an open primary is that they tend to be really big. You might have a lot of candidates. I once worked in a 9-way open primary. That's a really big primary. The best way to win the primary is by limiting the number of people you have to run against, right? So I'd really, really encourage you to focus on raising money early. Make fundraising the #1 priority of your campaign as soon as you launch. If you raise money quickly, it's going to seem hard to run against you. If you can already pay for things, no one's going to want to run against you because they'll have to raise more than you already did. I'd also encourage you to be really loud about running in your primary. Make it public. Tell everyone. Post on your Facebook. Send emails. All of the things. Do so much call time that everyone you know has to know that you're running. You can also draw distinctions in your biography and experience. Incorporate that into everything that you do. So as you reach out to those ideological donors, really draw distinctions. This doesn't need to be negative. It can be, but it doesn't need to be. You can talk about why you're the right candidate. You can talk about the things that you care about that no one else seems to. You can talk about policy differences you have. You can talk about background differences you have. Draw those experiences and then ask for donations after you do it. And then fundraising in a challenge primary. This actually looks a tiny bit different than fundraising in an open primary. Just like raising in an open primary, fundraising early is critical. Fundraising early is always important, but especially in a primary where you need to win to even get to the general ballot. So when you're fundraising in a challenge primary, you're going to really want to leverage those differences on with you and the incumbent. So going back to the thing we first talked about when we talked about starting strong, think about who you will have access to as a donor that the incumbent doesn't have access to. What values do you hold that the incumbent doesn't? In which ways are they out of line with the district? So our friend Representative Marie Newman here is saying we have to put the district in alignment with our values. What are those values you need to align with? Think hard about that and then connect with donors based on your answer to that question. I'd also think really hard about who your allies are. Who are the people in your community that are upset about what your incumbent is doing, who disagrees with a position that they might have, and then talk to them. Ask them to make a contribution to your campaign. Ask them to raise on your behalf. Ask them to host an event, whatever it might be. But draw them in. Talk to them about why it's important that they engage now, and talk to them about why they need to engage early. And then finally, just to reiterate, focusing on the issues is really, really important when you fundraise in a challenge primary. People won't donate just because you're running. They need a reason to donate. So focusing on the issues and what distinctions you can draw with yourself, between yourself and the incumbent, will help you make asks and help you make targeted asks to people who fit into your ideological circle specifically. So next, we'll talk a little bit more about Representative Newman in a case study. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Representative Newman won a primary here in Illinois, where I live, in 2020 against a longtime incumbent. Representative Newman is pro-choice. Her opponent wasn't. He was an anti-choice Democrat. She ran in the primary previously in 2018, did not win, and decided to run again. She knew she would be running again, so she started fundraising aggressively in 2019, really early. She told her donors, I'm running again, I'm going to win, we're going to flip this seat, and we'll have a pro-choice Democrat holding the seat and representing us in Congress. She also reached out to people that she knew that don't live in her district that also care about choice. So she focused really hard on building a donor base that cares about choice and that wants more pro-choice representation in Congress. So she built a coalition of donors who cared about the same things as her and were also committed to making ideological change. Conversely, her opponent wasn't that worried about this primary. He didn't think that he would lose, so he didn't fundraise aggressively or start early. And his donor base just wasn't as fired up. He didn't build on the issues and he didn't talk about issues quite as much and build that same diverse issue-focused donor base that Representative Newman did. So you'll see below a headline pulled from a Chicago newspaper that talks about primary challenger Marie Newman outraising her opponent, Representative Dan Lipinski, by nearly 2-1. That's a huge fundraising advantage. Outraising an incumbent is a big deal, and also some earned media talking about how well your campaign is doing is great. So that aggressive fundraising focused on an issue really took her far. It doesn't need to be something like choice necessarily. You can talk about issues specific to your community. I mentioned bridge repair. There's a marsh in my hometown that a city council candidate won by talking about last year. It could be something like a bond for a public works project. You could talk about, I don't know, waste. Emily used recycling as an example. Figure out what your issues are and who your ideological donors are, and you'll be able to build the same type of campaign and fundraising operation that Representative Newman did. All right, so that actually wraps up our fundraising section. Want to review some quick key takeaways from today, and then we will have some time for questions. So first, remember that the best way to win a primary is by distinguishing yourself as a candidate and proving that you can be competitive. So whether that's through fundraising or messaging, combination of the two, proving that you're competitive and distinguishing yourself is really important. Secondly, you need to lean on the parts of your Rolodex that your opponent doesn't have access to. Think about your personal circle and your ideological circle. Who are the people that will care about your campaign that your opponent just won't be able to reach? And then finally, remember that some people might decline to donate, and that's okay, but telling everyone about your campaign and reminding them why early investment is critical will take you far. Talking about your campaign and talking about raising money early will make sure that you're successful in the long run. And with that, I'll hand it back to Nancy for some questions.
Yes, I am back. Thanks so much, Sarah. So our first question is, I understand that you need a strong fundraising operation to be a contender in a competitive primary. But as a person that hates addressing others to ask for money, are there any tips to get over my fear of rejection?
Yes, so many tips, and I'll point you in the direction of some resources too. So first, the most important thing that I always say when we're talking to candidates is that you need to remember that you're not asking for money for yourself. You're asking for money for your campaign, and so you can build a community program, an operation that will make whatever district you're running in a better place. So if I'm running for office, I'm not asking for money for me, Sarah Carrillo. I'm asking for money to make the state of Illinois, Chicago, wherever I am, a better place. The second thing that you should remember is just that not everyone will say yes to contributing, primary or otherwise. It's just part of running for office. So keeping that in mind can be helpful. When you do get a no, think about how you can get that no to a yes. What can you ask that that person can say yes to? Think about if you're asking the right amount. If that person can't give $500, can they give $250? Can they give $100? They can't give $50, can they give $25? Can they make a recurring contribution of $10? Can they ask 5 friends to give $25? What can they say yes to? And then finally, if someone does say no, remember that it's okay. You'll ask a lot of people for contributions. Some of them will say no. That's just how it goes. It's probably not personal. You don't know why they said no. It's part of fundraising. You can also set yourself up for success by asking people in that personal circle for money first. So when you talk to your personal circle and ask them for contributions, you can remind them why you're running. You can talk to them about why you want to loop them in and help them be a part of this campaign from the start. These are the people that care about you. They want you to be successful. Chances are they'll say yes to a contribution. And if they say no, you can find what they can say yes to.
Awesome, thank you. And just to plug, next week, I believe we have a fundraising fundamentals training coming up. So yeah, if you need more help.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Nancy.
No, I was just going to say, if you need more help, it's coming up.
I did say there were resources and I didn't tell you what they were. If you're nervous about asking for money, the fundamentals of fundraising training is a great place to start. I would also encourage you to check out our training center at emilyslist.org. We have some great tools there that can help you Rolodex, can help you make that finance plan, help you make your budget. And I know I feel better with a plan. So if you feel that way too, you can work on those things to help you build some confidence before you make those asks.
Awesome, thank you. Our next question is, my main questions would be regarding petitioning and fundraising. What alternatives are there to in-person fundraising, and how should we approach petitioning during a pandemic?
These are great questions. I'll address fundraising specifically since that's my area of expertise. 2020 was a strange year for campaigns, right? But a lot of the campaigns my colleagues and I worked with really found some great alternatives. I would not be deterred at all by fundraising in a virtual world. You can absolutely focus on doing really, really, really good call time, and that can be the cornerstone of your fundraising operation. The more call time you do, the better you'll be. That's the case in any campaign, primary or not. But in a primary campaign, I'd really focus on doing that call time early and scheduling in lots of hours per week. And then telling people, I'm doing call time instead of these other mechanisms. Can you make an additional contribution to make sure that I'm able to raise what I need to? You can also consider doing some virtual fundraisers. If you want tips on that, we have a webinar, so you can check that out. And virtual fundraisers can be an effective way to gather people as well. And then finally, digital fundraising continues to be more and more relevant. So I'd make sure that you have an active email program, regardless of which office you're running for, but especially in a primary. And consider if there's other digital fundraising tools you'd like to use.
Awesome, thank you. And our last question is, if my primary is in 2022, how soon should I start fundraising?
Love this question. Like Emily said, you should start fundraising, well, as soon as you are legally allowed to. So you should check out your Secretary of State, your City Council office website, your Board of Elections, whatever it might be, to figure out when you can file for office and start raising money. That being said, you should start planning to fundraise now. So no matter when you think you'll be running for office, next year, 2 years, 5 years, who knows when in the future, you should start Rolodexing now. I'd encourage everyone who's ever thought about running for office to create a Rolodex, update it annually, include everyone that you meet in the year. I'd also make sure you keep your email addresses organized, keep contacts organized, start thinking about how you would fundraise if you were to run for office. Make a finance plan just for fun, see where it takes you. I would think about those things as soon as possible.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. And that's our last question. And this is the end of the training. So I just want to say thank you again to Sarah and Emily both for giving us all their knowledge on primaries and on fundraising. This has been super helpful to people in the comments, in the chat. And I'm just going to do a quick closeout. So thank you so much, Sarah. Bye. All right. So I just want to remind everyone that we will be sending an email out afterwards with the recording of the training and a survey. Please feel free to give us feedback on there. We really appreciate y'all's opinions about our webinars and how we can improve them and make them more accessible to everyone. So feel free to give us your opinion on there. We also just want to let y'all know about some resources that we have. So some of you might be from the Emily's List Run to Win list on Facebook, but if you're not, feel free to join. On there are women who have run in the past, who are thinking of currently running, who want to run in the future. You can go on there, ask your questions, post your success stories, post lessons learned. The women on there have a wealth of knowledge, and it'd be really great if you join that community. Another resource we have that both Emily and Sarah plugged was our training center. So it's completely free and it has different videos, modules, explanations and handouts on so many different topics in regards to running a campaign and running for office. So definitely take a look. It should be very helpful to you. And lastly, thank you to all our partners. Without them, we wouldn't be able to host these webinars. And thank you to all of you for joining today. So hopefully we'll see you all soon next week for our fundraising fundamentals training. And take care till then. Bye.